In this video, I'll show you how I made this epoxy filled coin bench seat. So to start off with, I used a Sharpie pen and traced off a few lines on the timber board. And then I used my router with a 6.35 mm double fluid shank, or rather a cutter bit, and I just followed the line. Basically, I eyeballed the line which I drew with a Sharpie pen and then just traced the bit to follow the line. I made a full pass on it with a 6.35 mm and increased the depth by around 2 mm or 3 mm. And once I did the full outline, I changed the 6.35 mm cutter bit to a 19 mm double fluted cutter bit. In this way, it'll shave off more stuff and it'll save a lot of time. So some of you may have seen my other video where I had posted it a few months ago saying fun with router. Now you know what this is. This is that part of that video. Anyway, coming back to this, I used this 19 mm bit and followed the line again all the way lengthwise. And I started off by cutting a shallow depth and then followed it up by cutting longer depths. This creates a right mess of shavings, so I just used my brush and removed the whole lot of shavings from the wood. And then I used my oscillating tool with the sander head on it, and I went ahead and sanded the edges to make it smooth. Once this was all done, I brought the seats back into my garage and I painted, or rather stained it with the mahogany color. This is so that I would have a deeper background and the coins would be a bit more prominent when it's filled up with epoxy. So I started off staining the first bench and I repeated the same process on the second bench as well. Now talking about the coins, these are probably around 10 pounds worth of coins in pennies, US cents, Indian rupees and the whole lot. So I washed that with water and then with a vinegar solution left it there in half an hour or so and then took it all out. Once the coins were dried, I just placed it like what you're seeing right now in the groove. I didn't stick it with a hot glue gun or anything like that. I just placed it on the bottom of it. Now for the epoxy, I use West Systems epoxy resin and 205 epoxy hardener. So I also got the pumps which comes with it, and that just makes the whole job a lot easier because you don't have to be too worried about mixing the correct ratio. It's just one push of the epoxy resin and one push on the hardener. And make sure you stir it, and the instructions are there on the back of the can. And you could use a different brand of epoxy, just make sure you follow the instructions of the manufacturer. Once you're done with it, just keep pouring it gently so that you don't push the coins or the coins doesn't float on the epoxy. In my case, I didn't actually have any situation where the coins floated. The weight of the coin was sufficient enough to hold it down. This whole process took around 30 to 45 minutes because I had 2 seats to fill in. Now I just used a hairdryer to blow out any bubbles that had formed over there. So I set the settings in high and just blasted away all the bubbles in it. And I also made sure that I didn't get any epoxy on the hairdryer, because if I do, and if my wife notices it, then I'll be in trouble. That's how it looked after I finished with the first round of the epoxy pour. In spite of using the hairdryer, I still did see bubbles on the side, and I guess they came up after I finished using the hairdryer. So you would notice that I only went like a m or 2 mm deep in the first round. So the next day I decided to do the second pour, in which I was planning to bring up the epoxy level further up till you don't see the notch on the wood. The process is essentially the same. You just mix one part of the resin with one part of the hardener, or rather it's actually 5 parts resin to 1 part hardener, but I meant 1 push of the epoxy resin and 1 push on the hardener bit. So after I did this, the next step was to create a small shoulder using aluminium foil tape that you see here. The plan is to pour epoxy all over the wood so that it looks like a countertop or something of that sort, where the entire seat is filled with epoxy in this case. So there you see me putting the aluminium foil backing tape, and after googling and seeing a few other videos, I decided that this was the best one, and this is the best one to do it for the epoxy pour. So make sure you press it really hard against the wood so that the epoxy resin doesn't pour in, and also make sure that you turn the top edges down. The idea in doing all this is that you don't want the epoxy to hit the sticky part of your tape, so make sure you press everything down and there's nothing sticking outside. Here's a close-up shot of what I actually meant by that. So just turn the top bit down and just press it against each other so that it forms a nice bank around the entire circumference. And by now you know the drill. You pour in the resin and the hardener, mix it up, and then just start the pour. This whole bench, right, is part of my Pergola build, and I'll have separate videos coming up for that. As of now, that is June 2018, I have finished building it, and I'm in the process of editing the video for that. Anyway, here is an extreme close-up of how it looks, and I really love this shine, this glassy look which has come out with this pour. So this is exactly what I was aiming for, and it looks really nice. But the process isn't over yet. There's still a few stages of sanding it and then filling it up. Here I am removing the aluminium foil backing tape. So next I use my random orbital sander with a 80 grit paper on it, and I went through all the edges of it. When you remove the tape, the edges will form kind of like a hill kind of a thing, which is really sharp, so you do need to sand it down. And just using an 80 grit paper will flatten it nice and smooth. You could also use a Stanley knife to cut through it if you need to. So here I am just sanding the top bit of it. This is how it looks right now. A real mess of all the fine epoxy sand dust on it. So I took an old rag and wiped out the excess of the dust on the top. I took a can of water and poured on it and wiped it clean with that. Next I took some polishing compound, and this essentially was some leftover car polishing compound. So I poured it on top of the bench and wiped it clean with a wet rag again. Now the polishing compound will cut through all the grime, dust, and it's supposed to remove it. So that's the reasoning behind why I decided to do that. Now I'll show you a close-up on how it actually looks when you're wiping it clean. So you see the white dust over there? So when you dip in the polishing compound and wipe on it, the whole white dust it just removes on its own. And then you do need to come back and clean it with a wet cloth, And then finally I used a 320 grit sandpaper now and went through the top of it just to give it that final smooth finish. To do the final clean, I'm just going to use white spirit and wipe it clean again with a wet cloth. And with this, all the cleaning part is now complete. The final coat will be this varnish, which is a yacht finish. It will give it a good, nice, glossy look to it, and it'll also hide all that white color left out from the sanding. So I just started applying a coat on it initially, and then I waited for 2 days and then went and did the second coat. So this is where I'll be fitting it. Now you will see why there are 2 holes on the side of the seats. This essentially I'll be sliding it in between the posts, and then once I build the pergola with the girders and the rafters and all that, this will look as if it's been built into the posts, and it should look really nice. So if you're interested in viewing this pergola build, I'll leave a link in the description below or at the card at the end. As I mentioned before, the video hasn't been edited yet, it's still in the process of editing. So here are some photos of how the epoxy bench looks. I think it looks really nice, and it actually adds character and a bit of drama to it. And you could do a similar thing where if you want to leave it indoors or on a bench or on a worktop, it's just the same kind of thing to do. Now if you're wondering how this will stand against the weather, here's a good shot when it rained. You can see that the water has just formed like a mega droplets on top of it. So what I'll do is I'll just use my hands and just push in all the droplets to the side of it. I want to see how the water flows and whether it'll go underneath the bench. So as you can see, the water flows to the side and then it just drips down. And the reason why it does that is I did use my router with a cow cutter bit and did a rain drip groove at the bottom. The details are there in the other build which I mentioned before. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope this video was useful, and if you like what you see, please consider giving me a thumbs up.